I have just bought one of the rarest Toyotas in the world, and in this video I'm going to show you the car and we're going to do an engine swap.
Over the past year, I've been creating content with one goal, and that goal has been to build the cars that never were. To use engine swaps, modifications, paint jobs, and anything I can think of to create performance versions of models that never had one. For example, last year we transformed a completely standard Honda Jazz into what I thought a Honda Jazz Type R would have looked like from the factory if Honda had ever made one. And more recently, we have just finished the build on our Volkswagen Fox GTI, which just like the Jazz Type R, is a performance model that doesn't exist. So throughout the past couple of weeks, I've been scouring the internet to try and find the next car in the series, and I have to say, I think this one will be the craziest car we've done yet.
So with all of that said, say hello to the new car. This is my new Toyota Sera, and to explain to you why on earth I've just bought this car, I only really need to do one thing, and that is to show you these doors. This car has dihedral doors from the factory, which I think is possibly the coolest feature to ever be fitted on a car from the factory. Now, to add to the coolness, these doors actually inspired the McLaren F1. That is not a joke, it's actually true. You can look it up. But that's not the only reason why I bought this car. It is also seriously cool and quirky. This interior is full of 1990s Japanese charm. It's got no practicality whatsoever, no cup holders, no door bins, nowhere to put anything, but it does have a ginormous steering wheel. We are furnished with a 5-speed manual gearbox, and also this car has a ridiculous amount of glass. It has glass up here, glass here, glass in the back as well. It is just like driving a bubble or your nan's conservatory. I absolutely love it. Now, the Toyota Seras were only ever made in Japan, meaning in the UK, they are very rare. And the vast majority of the ones that are in the UK are all automatics. So this manual is really, really rare indeed. Also with this color, and also with the fact this car is completely rust free, which you might not believe, but let me show you. Just take a look at this underside. It is absolutely mint. Of the rust that it does have, it is very minimal surface rust. I mean, our lower arms are looking fine. We've got absolutely no drips or leaks coming from anywhere whatsoever. We've got a completely clean chassis floor on both sides. It is all looking so clean under here. And our rear beam, I mean, just take a look at how unrusty that is. This is probably the best car I've ever bought from a rust perspective, and it is a 34-year-old import from Japan, which makes no sense, but I am not complaining. I really, really like this car. Now, the Sera does have a little bit of a flaw in my opinion, and that is what's under the bonnet. This engine is called the 5E FHE, and it is a 1.5 litre 4-cylinder engine with a measly 105 brake horsepower, which is not very exhilarating to put the foot down with. And yeah, this is the only engine configuration that these cars came with, meaning that the Sera, with its dihedral doors, never had a performance version, which I think is a very big shame. To show you what I mean, we have got the Sera on a very straight road to see how fast it can accelerate 0 to 60. So let's give it a go. 3, 2, 1. Yeah, not that exhilarating. And that's 60. What do we get?
11.18.
11.18. This is what I mean. It is very slow. So what are we going to do about this lack of performance? Well, I have come up with a bit of a plan. Now, the Sera itself might be pretty rare, but it actually shares its platform with a very common Toyota hatchback called the Starlet. And the Starlet is a very popular car to modify, which has great aftermarket support. And a lot of those parts which are for the Starlet will actually work on the Sera. And on top of that, whilst the Sera didn't come with a performance model, the Starlet did, and it was called the Glanzer.
The Glanzer is a renowned hot hatch from the 1990s, and it came with a 130 horsepower 1.3 litre turbo engine called the 4E FTE. And you might think that doesn't sound like a lot of horsepower, but because this engine has very strong pistons that are designed for the higher stresses that are associated with turbocharging without forging the internals on this engine, it is capable of up to 240 brake horsepower.
And you might be seeing where I'm going with this. That is the engine that I have just bought to install into the Sera to turn this car into an absolute weapon. Take a look. So here we have a 4E FTE engine, which has come straight out of a Glanzer. Now it also actually comes with the top mount intercooler that comes on the Glanzers from factory, which I think is pretty cool. Now I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, surely it makes no sense to swap out this 1.5 litre engine for this 1.3. Well, it actually does make sense to sacrifice those 200 cc's of displacement because, as I mentioned, this has those stronger pistons inside the engine, which is going to allow us to safely run more boost than with this engine. This, we'd probably have to forge the internals, we'd probably have to run some really expensive engine management system, whereas this, we can just bolt it in, maybe do a few bolt-on modifications, and we can get up to 240 brake horsepower, which makes this a much more cost-effective method. So in order to make our Sera a Sera T-Sport or a Sera TRD or maybe even a Sera GT, we've got to fit this engine into this engine bay. So let's get into it. So in terms of removing our 5E FHE engine, there's actually not a lot to do under here. So I've spotted we are of course going to have to remove this exhaust because it goes straight underneath the engine. And like any other engine removal, we are going to have to take out the drive shafts as well. But something I have noticed is this car has a complete lack of a front subframe. There is no subframe like there was on the Jazz or the Fox. It's just sort of the lower arms that are bolted up to the chassis itself. I've seen there might be a clearance issue with that alternator, if you can just see that up there with this lower arm, but I'm thinking we can actually keep these on whilst we remove the engine. So all that we have to do under here is take out the drive shafts and the exhaust and this under tray, and then everything else should be up at the top. So let's get on with it.
So first things first, I had to remove the front under tray, which is just held on with a few 10mm bolts. And now the under tray is off, I have better access to remove the exhaust, so I just have to undo 3 14mm nuts to disconnect the front section from the exhaust manifold. Now that's done, I can disconnect the front section from the midsection by undoing these 2 bolts. The next thing to do is to get out the old trusty angle grinder and chop off the old exhaust hangers. There's also a little O2 sensor to take out as well. There's then one final bolt to undo and then the exhaust can be removed.
So that is the old crusty front section of the Sera's exhaust removed. But now that is done, we can move on to what I've got behind me, and I have a feeling that this is really going to help with not only the Sera project, but also all of the future projects that I've got planned. Well, I feel like a kid at Christmas, Draper have just sent us out this insane tool chest and this big selection of tools as well. And most importantly for the Sera build, we have got this crimping set, which is going to be really, really important because we actually have to do a lot of rewiring to make the 4E engine work with that car. So that is going to be massively helpful. But so is all of this stuff for not just the Sera build, but all of our future builds as well.
So a massive thank you goes to Draper for sending out all of those tools. And after getting them all organised in our new tool chest, I could then begin with removing the drive shafts. And to do this, I of course had to start by removing the wheels. Now, a very frequent comment on my channel is that I just don't clean enough of the stuff that I'm working on. So as of this video, I am turning over a new leaf and I'm going to try and clean as much of the stuff I work on as possible. So before even starting on the drive shaft, I firstly got this wheel well looking as good as I could get it. And I am by no means a professional cleaner, so any tips in the comments would be appreciated. But once that was done, I could then start with removing the drive shaft, and the first thing to do is to take out this little pin which sits in the end of the drive shaft, and my new pliers from Draper were the perfect tool for the job. The next thing to do was to remove the hub nut. And once that was done, there were 2 nuts and 1 bolt to undo to disconnect the lower ball joint from the lower arm. And to actually get the lower arm and ball joint disconnected, I did have to use the pry bar. And at this point I decided it was a good idea to try and disconnect the gearbox side of the drive shaft with the pry bar, but I very quickly realised that I had forgotten a step.
And that's gearbox oil. Nope.
So to ensure that gearbox oil wouldn't go all over the workshop floor, I made sure to undo the gearbox drain plug, drain out all of the oil, and then I could go back to the drive shafts. So after taking out the gearbox side of the drive shaft, it was then just a matter of hitting out the hub side of the drive shaft with the hammer. And once that was done, it was then just a case of doing the exact same process again on the other side. I of course wanted to make sure to keep up with my new cleaning regime, so we had to clean this wheel arch as well. It's definitely not perfect, but I do think it's an improvement. And now that's done, I could get on with doing the drive shaft. Also, just a quick reminder to smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribing massively helps out the channel and it will allow me to keep on bringing you videos just like this.
So that's our drive shafts out. Now we can get the car down and start disconnecting everything from the top side of the engine bay.
Now, there are a load of jobs that we've got to get on with before we can remove the engine, and it can seem quite overwhelming sometimes, but I always just try and just go with the easiest job first. So I started off by taking out the battery. The next thing I decided to tackle was removing the airbox. And to take out that bottom half of the airbox, there's 2 bolts hiding underneath the air filter. At this point, I thought it would be a good idea to remove the front bumper and the headlights because this would give us much better access to the front of the engine and everything that we need to disconnect there. So to get started with this, I could remove the wheel arch liners. I discovered that there was a lot of dirt hiding behind the wheel arch liner, so I could go ahead and give this a good clean as well. I then of course had to do the same thing on the other side. After that, there were a few 10mm bolts underneath the front bumper that I also had to undo. alongside bolts on both of the corners of the front bumper as well. Once that was done, it was then time to remove both of the front headlights. And they're just held in with 3 bolts and a few electrical connections. And then lastly, after removing the indicator bulbs and some final few bolts, the bumper could be taken off.
So that is one front bumper removed, and the Sera is looking very sad indeed. We have removed its face, but what I think I want to get on with now is sort of removing the AC condenser, which sits here, and then also the radiator, which sits behind it. And then once that's done, it will give us better access to sort of the front of the engine, where we can disconnect some of the wiring loom. And then we also need to take out the gear selector cables, the clutch slave cylinder, and also the power steering fluid. There are a lot of little jobs that we still need to do before we can drop this engine. So let's keep going.
So the first thing I want to remove off the front section is the AC condenser, but before I can even do that, I've firstly got to remove its fan and also the bonnet latch. After that was done, there were 2 mounting bolts that I had to undo, and then also behind the AC condenser there were a couple of AC lines that I had to take off as well, but then the whole AC condenser could be removed. Next, it's onto the radiator, and before even starting this, we've got to drop the coolant out of the bottom hose. And then we can disconnect the top hose as well. And lastly, there are 2 bolts mounting the radiator at the top, which I've also got to undo, and then the radiator can be taken out. The next thing we need to address is disconnecting what I'm going to call the gear selection system. Firstly, our clutch slave cylinder needs to be removed. Now, this component is essentially responsible for engaging and disengaging the clutch. When you press your foot down on the clutch pedal when you want to change gear, it sends hydraulic pressure to the clutch slave cylinder, which in turn controls an arm inside the gearbox, which disengages the clutch and allows you to change gear. And removing this is pretty simple. There's just 2 bolts mounting it into place, and we also have to disconnect the clutch line. Next, we need to take off the gear selector cables. These do what they say on the tin and allow you to select which gear you want to be in by directly connecting the shifter in the cabin to the gearbox. And as for removing these cables, there's just a pin on the end of each cable that I need to remove. And then I also need to pop off the clip that mounts each of the cables into place. Once that's done, I can then do my best to move the gear cables out of the way, and then I can move on to the throttle cable. After sliding the throttle cable out, I can then undo this bracket with 2 spanners, and then I can get this out of the way as well. I could also disconnect the brake servo vac line, alongside a few other vacuum lines and also some electrical connections. I then moved on to taking off the fuel lines as well. I also had to remove the power steering lines because on the Sera, the power steering is belt driven. The power steering fluid did end up going everywhere, but it wasn't a problem a bit of brake cleaner couldn't fix. The last things I had to take off were the heater matrix pipes, which just sit at the back of the engine bay, and then it was just a matter of disconnecting all of the wiring loom, making sure not to leave any plugs plugged in.
Well, I am pretty sure that is now everything disconnected. It is admittedly a little bit of a mess in here, but I think we are pretty much there now. So all we need to do is get the car up on the ramp, undo that rear engine mount, and then get the car back down, slide a pallet underneath, and then we can disconnect those final 2 engine mounts and then lift the car over the engine.
So I could get the car up on the ramp and get started by unbolting that rear engine mount. The car could then come down and we had to get that pallet underneath, and then I could start unbolting the final 2 engine mounts. We could then finally remove this engine by lifting the car up with the ramp. And the most important thing I find with doing this is slow and steady wins the race. I did use a couple of blocks of wood to help support the engine, and generally when doing this, my technique is to give the 2-post ramp a couple of blips up and then check that we've still got clearance and that there's nothing still connected and that the engine's not crashing into anything, and then give the ramp a few more blips, check again, and keep doing that until the car is completely clear of the engine.
Pretty tight.
So that is one 5E FHE engine successfully removed out of the Sera, and I have to say that was probably one of the easiest engine removals I've ever done because everything just came apart so well. But I also think it has something to do with the fact that I bought such a good clean example of a Sera, and to make sure you're buying a good clean example of any used car, you need to run a Carvertical check. Carvertical can tell you all sorts of interesting information about a car's past, such as how many owners it's had, its MOT history, whether it's been stolen, whether it's had odometer fraud, and even if it's been in an accident.
Now, when you're running a report on a used car, what you're looking for is these 3 green ticks, which is a pretty good sign. But just check out the report on this Toyota Starlet. Whilst it has a green light for no mileage fraud, it has an amber warning light for both financial and legal status and for damage. If we investigate this report further, we can see that this car was so badly damaged that it was marked as a category B, which means it can't be put back on the roads. Alongside that, Carvertical actually shows us pictures of all of the damage that this car has sustained, which is very useful information.
So if I saw a Carvertical report which looked like that, I would make sure to not buy the car and stay well clear.
So to check any car on Carvertical, click the link in the description of this video and use the code JACK20 at the checkout for a 20% discount on the price of a Carvertical report.
Well, we now have both of the engines on the floor and together, and as you can see, they basically look identical. And that is because they almost are. These engines are both a part of the same family, the Toyota E-Series. Obviously, this is the 5E FHE, and this is the 4E FTE. So this engine and this engine are basically like brother and sister, but there are some subtle differences. Obviously, with this engine coming from the factory turbocharged, it has those stronger pistons that I mentioned earlier, and it also has an exhaust manifold which accommodates the turbo, but this specific exhaust manifold is actually aftermarket because the previous owner wanted to upgrade it, which is pretty cool. We also have, obviously, our turbo, and then the oil return from the turbo going into the sump, which this engine doesn't have. So it does have some minor differences, but because these engines are a part of the same family, we can generally use all of the stuff from this on this. Stuff like the drive shafts, the engine mounts, the gearbox, all of those parts we can just put on this engine and then bolt it in. So it should be a pretty easy swap.
So to get started with swapping some stuff over from the 5E to the 4E, we firstly needed to swap this oil pressure sensor, and the only reason is that the plugs are different on both of the engines, so to make it work with our current wiring loom, we need to use the oil pressure sensor from the 5E on the 4E. So once I had removed both of the oil pressure sensors, I could then get the 5E's one fitted onto the 4E. And after that was done, we could move on to swapping over the gearbox. So as for taking the gearbox off our 5E, there's just a few 17mm and 14mm bolts to undo. And once those are undone, the gearbox can be pulled free.
That is up there with one of the lightest gearboxes I have ever lifted. Now, we are going to go ahead and just whack this straight on, and I know a few of you are going to be wondering why we are not installing a new clutch. And the reason being is that later on down the line with the Sera project, we are going to be doing a big power video where we try and make this engine as spicy as we can possibly make it. And in that video, we will be installing a new clutch. So this clutch is just temporary, just to get the car running and driving. But later on down the line, a lot of the jobs that I know a lot of you will be screaming at me in the comments for not doing, we will be doing later, so don't worry.
So once I had got the 5E's gearbox fitted onto the 4E, I could then get it bolted up. We also had to swap over both of the radiator coolant hoses. The clutch slave cylinder had to get refitted as well. And once that was done, the final things to transfer over was firstly the AC pump, because I wanted AC in the Sera, which is basically a glass box, and also the power steering pump, because as you can see on both of the engines, they are slightly different. And after getting both of those pumps off the 5E, I could work on getting them on the 4E.
Okay, so I have just realised why the two power steering pumps on the engines are different. They actually have different mounting brackets for the tensioners, and the reason why they have different mounting brackets is because the oil filter is further over this way on the 4E to accommodate for the turbo. Basically meaning we are going to have to use the 4E's power steering pump. Obviously I didn't realise this before, but this hasn't been a waste of time because we still need to get our AC pump fitted as well. So we're going to do that, but then get the 4E power steering pump refitted back onto the engine. Right, so that is everything swapped over from the 5E onto the 4E, meaning it is now ready to be installed. And the plan is to get all of the ECU connected up, to get the fuel lines in, and to try and start this engine in this video. And I have brought a friend along, Tom. You might remember him from the Jazz videos. He helped us get the K20 in the Jazz, and we are going to get the engine fitted into the Sera, so let's do it.
So after getting the engine into position, we could work on lowering the Sera down and bolting the engine into place.
So it needs to come forward loads. Yeah, that'll do. No, yeah, keep going. That sounded good.
You don't need to do that. Keep going. Yep, that'll do.
Once both the driver's and passenger side engine mounts were done up, we could then get the car up on the ramp and do up the rear engine mount. Once the engine was fully mounted, Tom and I could then go over the whole wiring loom and try to get it all connected up.
Okay, so we have run into a slight problem. Essentially, at the beginning of this, I thought the only sensor we'd have to swap over from the 5E to the 4E was that oil pressure sensor, but it turns out we have to swap over a fair few more sensors, like the NOx sensor. Our alternator needs to be changed as well. It's not that deep, it is just a case of swapping stuff over, but this definitely would have been a lot easier with the engine out.
So to get on with this, Tom could get on with swapping over the alternator and the NOx sensor.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So this is our old alternator, and you'll see the plug on the back is a 3-pin sort of rectangular style. And our new / old alternator is a nice big round plug. Oh, yes. So the wiring wasn't compatible.
So whilst Tom was getting that alternator fitted onto the 4E, I could work on getting our throttle position sensor swapped over as well, because that was another thing we forgot to swap over. And once that was done, the last things we had to connect up was firstly the fuel lines, and then also the battery.
I was sort of ready for that.
Yeah, it happened last time.
This car has like an immobiliser on it where it
Scared the shit out of you.
Yes! I'm a normal human being. Well, I say that.
Now is time for the moment of truth. Will the 4E FTE engine start? We've connected the minimal amount of stuff possible to make it start, so that's most of the wiring loom and also the fuel lines. So we're going to turn the key over now and see if it will start. But there is one big caveat. We are using the 5E's ECU and not the correct 4E's ECU. It hasn't turned up yet. I have ordered it, but we're just going to try and see if it will start on the 5E's ECU. So let's give it a go. Tom, whenever you are ready, send it. Ooh. Come on. Okay, cut it. It's so nearly started then. I think so. Hang on. There's no reason why you wouldn't have fuel pressure though. Yeah, go again, go on. Come on! It is. Tom. What the heck? Oh, Tom, kill it. That's good. That has got to be up there one of the roughest first starts we've had on the channel. Ladies and gentlemen, if you did go on to enjoy this video, make sure to smash that like button, click that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next one.